Sedna, goddess of the sea. Picture this. A young woman falls from a kayak into the freezing Arctic Ocean. Her father chops off her fingers one by one as she desperately clings to the boat. Those severed fingers transform into seals, whales, and walruses. And she becomes the most powerful and terrifying goddess in Inuit mythology. This is the story of Sedna, the goddess of the sea, and I promise you've never heard anything like it. Before we dive into the depths of this haunting tale, let me ask you something. What would you do if your own family betrayed you in the most unimaginable way? Would you find it in your heart to forgive them? Or would your rage reshape the very fabric of the world? Today, we're traveling to the frozen edges of the earth, to a time when the Inuit people survived on the razor's edge between life and death, where every seal hunted meant survival, and every storm could mean extinction. In this harsh, unforgiving landscape, they told stories of a goddess who controlled their fate from the bottom of the ocean. A goddess born from betrayal, violence, and transformation. The story of Sedna isn't just another mythology tale you'll forget tomorrow. It's a story about power and powerlessness, about how victims can become forces of nature, and about the price we pay when we break our most sacred bonds. It's about a woman who became a goddess not through glory, but through suffering so profound it changed the Arctic seas forever. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why Inuit shamans still journey to the ocean floor to comb Sedna's hair, why hunters whisper prayers before every hunt, and why this ancient goddess might be more relevant today than ever before. To understand Sedna's story, we first need to understand the world she came from. Imagine living in one of the most extreme environments on planet Earth. The Arctic, where winter temperatures plummet to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, where the sun disappears for months at a time, and where a single mistake can cost you your life. This was the reality for the Inuit people who have inhabited the Arctic regions of Greenland, Canada, and Alaska for thousands of years. The Inuit didn't just survive in this environment, they thrived. They developed sophisticated hunting techniques, created ingenious tools from bone and stone, and built entire communities on the ice. But survival came at a cost. Every day was a negotiation with nature, a delicate balance between taking what you needed and respecting the forces that could destroy you in an instant. In Inuit culture, the boundary between the physical and spiritual world was thin, almost transparent. Animals weren't just food sources. They were spiritual beings with souls, beings that chose to give themselves to hunters who showed proper respect. The Northern Lights weren't just a beautiful phenomenon. They were the spirits of the dead playing ball with a walrus skull. The wind wasn't just air moving. It was the breath of powerful beings who could help or harm you. Everything was alive. Everything was connected. And everything had consequences. The Inuit developed a rich oral tradition to pass down knowledge, wisdom, and warnings from generation to generation. These weren't fairy tales to entertain children before bed. These were survival manuals disguised as stories, teaching lessons about respect, consequence, and the natural order of things. And no story was more important, more frequently told, or more deeply feared than the story of Sedna. Different Inuit communities across the Arctic told variations of her tale, and she went by many names: Sedna, Nulliajuk, Talyalayak, Arnaquigsak. But the core of the story remained the same, a cautionary tale about a young woman, a terrible betrayal, and the birth of a goddess who would control the fate of all Arctic peoples for generations to come. Now, you might be wondering, why did the Inuit need a goddess of the sea? Let me paint you a picture. The Inuit diet consisted almost entirely of marine mammals: seals, walruses, whales, and fish. The sea provided everything: food, oil for lamps, skins for clothing, boats, bones for tools and weapons. Without the sea's bounty, the Inuit couldn't survive. But the sea was also terrifying, unpredictable, deadly. Storms could arise without warning. Ice could crack beneath your feet. Hypothermia could claim you in minutes if you fell into the freezing water. The sea gave life, and the sea took it away. The Inuit needed to understand this force. They needed to explain why sometimes the hunting was good and sometimes entire communities starved. They needed a way to feel some control over the uncontrollable. They needed Sedna. But here's what makes Sedna different from many other sea deities across world mythologies. She didn't start as a goddess. She didn't descend from the heavens or emerge fully formed from sea foam like Aphrodite. Sedna was human. She was a girl, a daughter, someone who should have been protected and loved. And what happened to her, what transformed her into a goddess, was an act of human cruelty so profound that it echoed through the spiritual realm itself. Are you ready to hear what happened? Because there's no turning back from this story. Our story begins in a small Inuit settlement on the Arctic coast. The exact location and time are lost to history, as oral traditions often are, but that's not what matters. What matters is that there lived a girl who would become known as Sedna. Now, here's where different versions of the story start to diverge, and I find this fascinating because each variation tells us something different about the culture that told it. In some versions, Sedna was extraordinarily beautiful, so beautiful that men came from distant settlements to seek her hand in marriage. But Sedna was proud, perhaps too proud. She rejected every suitor, finding fault with each one. This one was too short. That one wasn't a good enough hunter. Another had an unpleasant smell. One by one, she turned them away, despite her father's growing frustration. In other versions, Sedna wasn't vain at all. She was simply content. She loved her father, she loved her life, and she saw no reason to leave the security of her home for an uncertain future with a stranger. In this telling, her refusal to marry wasn't about pride, it was about choosing her own path. And in yet another variation, Sedna was cursed or different in some way, perhaps disabled or disfigured, and no one wanted to marry her at all. Her father, ashamed and burdened by her presence, sought any opportunity to be rid of her. Which version is true? In mythology, they all are. Each version reflects different anxieties and values of the communities that told them. Fears about pride, questions about a daughter's duty, concerns about caring for vulnerable family members. But regardless of which version we follow, the next part remains consistent across tellings, and this is where the story takes its dark turn. One day, a stranger arrived at the settlement. He came in a kayak, paddling from across the sea, and he was unlike any man Sedna had ever seen. In most versions, he appeared to be a handsome, wealthy hunter, dressed in fine furs and claiming to come from a land where food was always abundant, where she would never know hunger or cold, where she would live in comfort and luxury. "Come with me," he said to Sedna. "Become my wife, and you'll live in a tent made of the finest seal skins. You'll sleep on the softest furs. You'll never have to work. I'll bring you all the fish and meat you could ever want." Sedna was intrigued. Or perhaps she was pressured by her father, who saw an opportunity to finally have his daughter married off. Or maybe she fell in love with the stranger's promises, dreaming of an easier life. The father agreed to the match. Sedna, whether willingly or not, prepared to leave the only home she'd ever known. She packed her belongings, said her goodbyes, and climbed into the stranger's kayak. As they paddled away from shore, her father watched from the beach. Did he feel relief? Guilt? Sadness? The stories don't say, but what they do tell us is this: he would soon regret letting his daughter go. The journey across the water took hours, perhaps days. The stranger paddled steadily, taking Sedna farther and farther from home, until her settlement was nothing but a distant memory on the horizon. Finally, they reached an island, a rocky, desolate place surrounded by crashing waves and screaming seabirds. And this is where the stranger's deception was revealed. He wasn't a man at all. In the most common version, the stranger was a petrel, a seabird who had taken human form to trick Sedna. He transformed back into his true shape, and Sedna saw the horrible truth. There was no tint of fine seal skins. There was only a nest of twigs and feathers perched on a rocky cliff. There was no abundance of food, only the scraps of fish and the carcasses of sea creatures. There were no soft furs to sleep on, only hard stone and the constant, maddening noise of other seabirds. Sedna had been deceived, trapped, stolen. She was now the prisoner of a bird spirit, married to a creature who had lied about everything, living in conditions of deprivation and isolation. The promises of comfort and luxury had been nothing but a trick to lure her away from the protection of her family and community. Can you imagine the horror of that realization? The betrayal? The absolute helplessness? Sedna wept. She cried out across the waves, but no one could hear her over the wind and the calls of the birds. She was trapped on that desolate island with a husband who wasn't even human, living a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Days turned to weeks. Weeks might have turned to months. The stories aren't clear on how long Sedna suffered in this prison, but what they do tell us is that her cries eventually reached someone who could help her. Her father. Back at the settlement, Sedna's father began to feel the weight of what he'd done. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe he had a dream or a vision. Maybe he heard his daughter's voice on the wind. Different versions offered different motivations, but the result was the same. He realized his daughter was in terrible danger, and he decided to rescue her. The father prepared his kayak, packed supplies, and set out across the treacherous waters to find Sedna. After a long and difficult journey, he finally reached the rocky island where she was being held. When Sedna saw her father, her relief must have been overwhelming. Finally, someone had come for her. Finally, she could escape this nightmare and return home. She climbed into her father's kayak, and together they pushed off from the shore, paddling as fast as they could back toward their settlement. But they weren't alone. The petrel husband returned to find Sedna gone, and he was furious. This was his wife, his possession, stolen from him. He took to the sky, flying after the escaping kayak, calling out in rage. Now, this is where the story becomes truly mythological. The petrel's cries were so powerful, so filled with fury, that they stirred up the sea itself. Some versions say the bird spirit summoned a storm. Others say his wings beat the air so violently that massive waves rose up around the fleeing kayak. Still others suggest that the petrel called upon other spirits to punish the thieves who had stolen his bride. However it happened, the father and daughter suddenly found themselves in the middle of a terrible tempest. Waves as tall as mountains crashed around their small boat. The wind howled like a living thing. The kayak pitched and rolled, threatening to capsize at any moment. The father paddled desperately, trying to keep the boat steady, but he knew they wouldn't survive the storm. The sea was too angry. The waves were too high. They were going to drown. And then, in a moment of pure, primal terror, the father made a decision that would echo through Inuit mythology forever. He looked at his daughter, and he made a calculation. One life or two, his survival or hers. And in that moment, whether driven by fear, selfishness, or some twisted logic of self-preservation, he decided that Sedna had to die. The father reached over and pushed his daughter into the freezing Arctic water. Let that sink in for a moment. Her own father, the man who had created her, raised her, and then rescued her, now threw her to her death to save himself. But Sedna didn't sink immediately. Desperate to survive, she reached up and grabbed the edge of the kayak with both hands, her fingers white-knuckled against the rim, trying to pull herself back in. "Father, help me, please." But the father didn't help her. Instead, He picked up his paddle, or in some versions, a knife or axe, and he brought it down on Sedna's fingers. He chopped off the first joint of her fingers. Sedna's severed fingertips fell into the water, and as they sank into the depths, something miraculous and terrible happened. They transformed. Each piece of flesh and bone became a seal, swimming away into the dark water. But Sedna still held on with what remained of her hands, her survival instinct refusing to let her die. She pulled herself up again, trying once more to climb back into the boat. "Please, Father, I'm your daughter." But the father struck again. This time, he cut off the second joints of her fingers. These pieces fell into the water and transformed into walruses, massive creatures that dove deep into the ocean. Sedna's hands were now useless stumps, but still, driven by sheer will to live, she tried one more time to grip the kayak, using her palms, her wrists, whatever she could. The father struck a third time. He cut off the final parts of her hands at the wrists. These pieces became whales, the largest creatures in the sea, and they descended into the depths with the seals and walruses. With nothing left to hold on to, Sedna finally lost her grip. She sank beneath the waves, down, down, down into the cold, dark depths of the Arctic Ocean. The storm immediately ceased. The sea became calm. The petrel, having witnessed this sacrifice, or perhaps satisfied that Sedna was dead, flew away. The father paddled home alone, having survived, but at a cost that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. But Sedna didn't die, at least, not in the way you might think. Here's where the story transcends ordinary tragedy and becomes truly mythological. Because Sedna's death was not an ending, it was a transformation. As Sedna sank deeper and deeper into the ocean, something extraordinary happened. The trauma of her betrayal, the violence done to her by her own father, the severing of her connection to the human world, all of this pain and suffering crystallized into something new, something powerful, something immortal. Sedna didn't drown. Instead, she transformed into a goddess. She descended all the way to the bottom of the sea, to a place deeper than any human could reach, and there she made her home. In some versions, she lives in a great house made of stone and whalebone. In others, she sits on the ocean floor itself, surrounded by the spirits of marine animals. But in all versions, she is no longer human. She is Sedna, goddess of the sea, mistress of all marine life, controller of the weather and the waves. And here's the crucial part. Remember those severed fingers that became seals, walruses, and whales? Those creatures, and all other marine mammals, now belong to Sedna. They are part of her body, extensions of her being. She controls their movements, decides when they can be hunted, and determines whether the Inuit people will eat or starve. Think about the profound symbolism here. The very animals that the Inuit depend on for survival are literally born from Sedna's pain and dismemberment. Every seal harvested, every walrus hunted, every whale that feeds a community, each one is a reminder of Sedna's sacrifice and suffering. The Inuit cannot eat without confronting the goddess's trauma. But Sedna is not a benevolent goddess. How could she be? She was betrayed by her husband, murdered by her father, and violently transformed into something neither living nor dead. She carries the rage of that betrayal in her immortal heart. When Sedna is angry, the sea becomes stormy. Waves crash and boats capsize. When Sedna is vengeful, she holds back the animals. The seals don't come. The whales swim away. The walruses hide. And the Inuit people starve. But why does Sedna become angry? What provokes her wrath? This is where the story becomes a sophisticated system of environmental and social ethics. Sedna becomes angry when humans break taboos. When hunters disrespect the animals they kill. When people waste the gifts of the sea. When women break menstruation taboos, or when certain rituals are not properly performed. when humans act with cruelty, greed, or thoughtlessness. You see, every time someone transgresses against the natural or social order, that transgression becomes tangled in Sedna's hair. Oh, I haven't mentioned the hair yet. This is important. Sedna has long, beautiful hair, but because her fingers were cut off, she cannot comb it herself. Over time, as humans commit their various offenses and violations, Sedna's hair becomes tangled and matted with the dirt and debris of human wrongdoing. These tangles cause her pain and distress, and in her pain, she becomes angry and withholds the animals from the hunters. This is the brilliant metaphor at the heart of the Sedna story. Human misbehavior literally causes the goddess pain, and that pain manifests as natural consequences, failed hunts, storms, and starvation. The Inuit understood something that modern people often forget. We are not separate from nature. Our actions have consequences. The environment responds to how we treat it. Disrespect the balance, and the balance will be restored at your expense. But the story doesn't end with Sedna sitting on the ocean floor, nursing her anger and withholding animals out of spite. Because the Inuit also developed a solution, a way to restore harmony when things went wrong. And that solution involved one of the most dangerous and incredible spiritual journeys in any mythology. The shaman's journey to comb Sedna's hair. When hunting became scarce, when the community faced starvation, when storms ravaged the coast and nothing seemed to go right, the Inuit people knew what it meant. Sedna was angry, and her hair needed to be combed. But who could possibly travel to the bottom of the ocean to soothe an angry goddess? Who could face Sedna's wrath and survive? Only the Angakik, the shaman. In Inuit culture, shamans were intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. They could see and communicate with spirits invisible to ordinary people. They could heal illnesses, predict the future, control the weather, and, most importantly, they could travel to other realms in spirit form while their physical body remained behind. When a community needed Sedna's favor restored, they would call upon their shaman to make the perilous journey to the ocean floor. This wasn't a casual ritual or a symbolic gesture. This was understood to be an actual, dangerous spiritual voyage that could cost the shaman their life or sanity. The ceremony would begin with the entire community gathering. The shaman would enter a trance state, often through rhythmic drumming, chanting, and sometimes by being tied up with sealskin ropes that would mysteriously loosen as their spirit left their body. The people would watch as the shaman's spirit departed, leaving behind a body that appeared lifeless or in a deep sleep. Now, the shaman's journey to Sedna was not a simple descent. Between the human world and Sedna's realm lay obstacles and guardians, tests that ensured only the most powerful and determined shamans could reach the goddess. First, the shaman had to pass through a region of mist and confusion, where spirits tried to lead them astray or turn them back. Many shamans got lost here, their spirits wandering in the liminal space between worlds, unable to return to their bodies or continue to their destination. If they made it through the mist, they next encountered a great gulf or abyss, a place where the spirit could fall forever into oblivion. Some versions describe a narrow bridge or a wheel of ice that continuously rotated. The shaman had to time their crossing perfectly or be flung into the void. Then came the guardians, fierce spirits in the form of dogs, seals with gnashing teeth, or the father himself, standing guard and trying to prevent anyone from reaching Sedna. The shaman had to fight, trick, or negotiate their way past these obstacles, using their spiritual power and cunning. Finally, after overcoming all these challenges, the shaman would descend to the very bottom of the ocean, to Sedna's dwelling place. And there, they would find the goddess. Imagine the scene, the goddess sitting in her house of stone and bone, her back turned, her long hair hanging down in a mass of tangles, filled with the dirt and debris of human transgressions. Around her, the spirits of seals, walruses, and whales swim in the dark water, waiting to see what would happen. Sedna would not make it easy. She was angry, she was in pain, and she had every right to be both. The shaman couldn't command her or demand anything from her. Instead, they had to approach with humility and respect, acknowledging her suffering and the wrongs that humans had committed. Mother of the Sea, the shaman would say, "We come in humility. We have wronged you. We have broken our taboos and caused you pain. We are sorry. Please, let us make amends." If Sedna was in a merciful mood, or if the shaman's plea was sincere enough, she would allow them to approach. And then, the shaman would gently, carefully, begin to comb her hair. Think about the intimacy of this act. Combing someone's hair is a gesture of care, of tenderness, of personal connection. It's something you do for loved ones, for children, for those who cannot do it themselves. The shaman wasn't performing a grand magical ritual or offering a material sacrifice. They were providing comfort to a suffering being. As the shaman combed, they would carefully remove each tangle, acknowledging each transgression that created it. "We are sorry for wasting the seal's meat. We are sorry for hunting without proper respect. We are sorry for breaking the taboos." Slowly, carefully, the tangles would come free. Sedna's hair would become smooth and clean again. And as it did, her anger would ease. Her pain would lessen. And crucially, she would release the animals. "You may hunt again," she would say. "But remember your responsibilities. Remember what happens when you forget." The shaman would thank her, bow respectfully, and then begin the dangerous journey back to the world of the living, ascending through the ocean, past the guardians, across the abyss, through the mist, and finally, back to their body. The community would watch as the shaman gasped and returned to consciousness, exhausted from their ordeal. They would report what they had seen and what Sedna had said. And then, according to the stories, the hunting would improve. The animals would return. The storms would calm. Balance would be restored. Until the next time humans grew careless or disrespectful, and Sedna's hair began to tangle once again. This cycle, transgression leading to consequence, followed by acknowledgement and restoration, formed the heart of Inuit spiritual ecology. It wasn't about blind worship or appeasing a cruel deity. It was about maintaining relationships, honoring agreements, and understanding that actions have consequences that ripple through the entire web of existence. Now, I've been telling you the most common version of Sedna's story, but the truth is that there are dozens of variations across different Inuit communities. And these variations are fascinating because they reveal different cultural anxieties, values, and understandings of the myth. Let me share some of the most interesting alternative versions with you. In some Greenlandic traditions, Sedna isn't thrown from a kayak at all. Instead, she's a girl who refuses to marry, and her father, angered by her disobedience, marries her to a dog. Yes, a dog. She gives birth to children who become ancestors of various peoples, some human and some supernatural. In this version, Sedna's transformation into a sea goddess comes later, through a different series of betrayals and transformations, but the core theme remains: family betrayal leading to supernatural power. In certain Canadian Arctic traditions, Sedna is called Nuliajuk, and she's described as having a more complex personality. She's not just angry. She's moody, unpredictable, sometimes playful, sometimes cruel. In these stories, she occasionally rises from the deep to visit the surface world, and shamans must be constantly vigilant to monitor her moods and anticipate her needs. Some versions emphasize Sedna's father more prominently. In these tellings, after pushing Sedna into the ocean, the father returns home but is consumed by guilt. He becomes haunted by visions of his daughter. In some accounts, Sedna eventually causes a storm that drowns her father, dragging him down to her realm where he becomes her servant, forced to guard her home for eternity. This version adds a layer of cosmic justice to the story. The betrayer becomes eternally bound to the one he betrayed. Other variations focus on Sedna's husband, the petrel. In some, he's not a deceiver at all, but a genuine lover who transforms into a bird as part of a curse or test. When the father steals Sedna away, the petrel's grief and anger are justified, making the entire tragedy more complex. Who is the real villain? The deceiving husband, the murderous father, or fate itself? In some Alaskan traditions, the story has a different beginning entirely. Sedna is a giant woman, incredibly strong and with an insatiable appetite. She begins eating everything in her community, including her own parents. In terror, the villagers attack her, cutting off her fingers as she tries to cling to a boat, and she sinks to become the sea goddess. This version transforms Sedna from a victim to a threat, though she still becomes a goddess through dismemberment and betrayal. There are even versions where Sedna has sisters or other family members who play important roles in the story, where she has children who become sea spirits, or where she has a more active role in choosing her transformation rather than having it forced upon her. What's remarkable is that despite these variations, certain core elements remain consistent across nearly all versions. 1. Sedna was originally human, usually female, usually young. 2. She is betrayed by family, most often her father. 3. She undergoes a violent transformation involving the severing of her fingers. 4. Those fingers become sea mammals. 5. She becomes a goddess who controls the availability of marine animals. 6. Her anger must be soothed through shamanic intervention when she withholds the animals. 7. Human behavior directly affects her mood and, consequently, the success of hunting. These consistent elements reveal what was truly important to the Inuit people who told and retold these stories across vast distances and many generations. The relationship between human behavior and natural abundance, the consequences of betrayal, the power that can emerge from victimhood, and the need for intermediaries who can restore balance when things go wrong. Different communities emphasize different aspects based on their own experiences and concerns. Coastal communities that relied heavily on whaling emphasized Sedna's control over whales. Inland communities might focus more on her control of seals or fish. Communities that experienced internal conflicts might emphasize the betrayal aspects, while those facing harsh environmental conditions might emphasize Sedna's role in controlling weather. The genius of oral tradition is this flexibility. The story could adapt to meet the needs of each community while maintaining its essential structure and teachings. Sedna wasn't frozen in a single authoritative version. She was alive, evolving, responding to the changing needs and circumstances of the people who told her story. And this brings us to an important question. What happened to Sedna when the Inuit people encountered Christianity? When European explorers, missionaries, and colonizers arrived in the Arctic regions, they brought with them not just technology and disease, but also a completely different worldview. And the story of Sedna became a battleground for cultural survival. Christian missionaries saw Inuit mythology as pagan superstition at best, demonic worship at worst. Sedna, with her origin story of violence and her demands for ritual appeasement, was particularly problematic from a Christian perspective. Missionaries worked actively to suppress traditional Inuit spiritual practices, including the telling of traditional stories and the practice of shamanism. Children were taken from their families and placed in residential schools where speaking Inuktitut was forbidden and traditional stories were banned. An entire generation grew up disconnected from their cultural heritage, including the stories of Sedna and other important spiritual figures. The chain of oral tradition, unbroken for thousands of years, was violently disrupted. Shamans, the intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, were particular targets. Christianity had no place for these spiritual practitioners who claimed direct communication with non-Christian entities. Many shamans converted, some sincerely, others to avoid persecution. Some practiced in secret, maintaining the old ways underground. Others simply died, taking their knowledge with them. For a time, it seemed like Sedna might be lost entirely, relegated to anthropological footnotes and dusty academic papers written by outsiders who studied the Inuit as curiosities rather than as living people with ongoing cultures. But something interesting happened. Sedna survived. Despite the best efforts of colonizers and missionaries, the story of Sedna proved remarkably resilient. Parents continued to tell the story to their children in whispers. Communities maintained the memory even when they couldn't practice the rituals. The story adapted, sometimes incorporating Christian elements, sometimes existing alongside Christian beliefs in a syncretic blend, sometimes persisting in pure form in remote communities less affected by colonial influence. By the mid-20th century, as indigenous rights movements gained strength and cultural pride began to resurface, Sedna experienced a renaissance. Inuit artists began depicting her in sculptures and prints. Writers recorded the stories. Elders who remembered the old ways began teaching young people again. Sedna returned, not as a relic of the past, but as a living symbol of cultural identity and resilience. Today, Sedna occupies a complex space in Inuit culture. Some Inuit people practice Christianity and see Sedna as an outdated myth. Others have reclaimed her as a spiritual reality. Many fall somewhere in between, appreciating her as a cultural story and symbol even if they don't literally believe in her existence. But here's what's fascinating. The core teachings of the Sedna story, the emphasis on respecting animals, maintaining balance with nature, understanding that human actions have environmental consequences, these teachings have become more relevant, not less, in the modern era. Because the Arctic is changing rapidly, and Sedna's story has taken on new significance in the context of climate change. If Sedna's hair becomes tangled by human transgressions, imagine how it looks today. The Arctic is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet. Sea ice, which Inuit communities have depended on for transportation, hunting, and cultural practices for millennia, is disappearing. In some regions, ice that once lasted year-round now melts completely in summer. Ice that once formed thick and reliable is now thin and unpredictable. The animals are changing their patterns. Seals are hauling out in different locations. Whales are migrating at different times. Fish species that never existed in Arctic waters are appearing, while traditional species are moving northward or declining in numbers. The weather has become erratic. Traditional knowledge that guided hunters for generations, knowledge about ice conditions, weather patterns, animal behavior, is becoming unreliable. Elders who could once predict conditions with incredible accuracy find that the old signs no longer work. For Inuit communities, these changes aren't just environmental statistics. They're threats to cultural survival. Hunting isn't just about food. It's about identity, connection to land and ancestors, teaching the next generation, and maintaining relationships with the animal world. And here's where Sedna becomes powerfully relevant. If the story teaches that human disrespect for the natural world leads to scarcity and hardship, what does it say about a global industrial civilization that has fundamentally altered the Arctic climate? Some Inuit activists and leaders have invoked Sedna in the context of climate change, suggesting that the goddess is angry about humanity's massive, systematic disrespect for the natural world. The tangled hair isn't just about individual hunters breaking taboos anymore. It's about fossil fuel emissions, industrial pollution, and a global economic system built on extraction and exploitation. In this reading, Sedna becomes a prophet, her story a warning that modern humanity ignored. The consequences she threatened, scarcity, storms, the disappearance of animals, are now manifesting not as supernatural punishment, but as the predictable results of ecological imbalance. Several Inuit artists have created works explicitly connecting Sedna to climate change. Sculptures show her surrounded by melting ice or drowning in plastic pollution. Stories reimagine her as a goddess, angry not at Inuit hunters, but at southern industrialized nations whose emissions are destroying her realm. There's something profound here about how ancient mythologies can speak to modern crises. Sedna's story, thousands of years old, contains within it a sophisticated understanding of human-environment relationships that much of the modern world is only now beginning to grasp. We are not separate from nature. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences will eventually demand accounting. But using Sedna as a climate change symbol is also complicated. Some indigenous scholars warn against appropriating indigenous myths for environmental messages that might ultimately serve non-indigenous interests. They point out that while Sedna can teach important lessons about respecting nature, she is first and foremost an Inuit cultural figure, not a universal eco-goddess for everyone to adopt. There's also the question of how Inuit people themselves want to engage with their traditional stories in the modern context. Some embrace the connection between Sedna and climate activism. Others prefer to keep Sedna as a more private, community-specific figure. Still others question whether ancient myths should be burdened with solving contemporary problems. What's clear is that Sedna continues to evolve, as she always has through oral tradition, to meet the needs and circumstances of the people who tell her story. And right now, as the Arctic faces unprecedented change, her story of betrayal, transformation, and the consequences of broken relationships feels remarkably timely. Beyond the Arctic, beyond even indigenous communities, Sedna has swum into broader popular culture, appearing in books, movies, video games, and art in ways that range from respectful to, well, let's just say creative. In literature, Sedna appears in numerous fantasy and science fiction works. She's been featured in Neil Gaiman's work, in young adult fantasy novels, in children's books, and in literary fiction exploring indigenous themes. Some of these portrayals are deeply researched and respectful. Others use her name and basic concept, but transform her into something barely recognizable from the original stories. In animation and film, Sedna has appeared in various forms. She was featured in an episode of the animated series Avatar: The Last Airbender, though the connection was loose and the character was more inspired by than based on Sedna. Canadian and Indigenous filmmakers have created more authentic portrayals, including animated shorts and documentaries exploring her story from Inuit perspectives. Video games have discovered Sedna as well. She appears in Smite, a game featuring gods and mythological figures from various cultures, where she's portrayed as a powerful sea goddess with abilities based on her mythology. In Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games, she's sometimes included as a deity option for characters, particularly those with ocean or nature themes. Music has also drawn on Sedna's story. Inuit throat singers have created pieces inspired by her legend. Classical composers have written orchestral works based on her tale. Folk musicians have adapted her story into songs. Metal bands have written songs about her, because apparently, nothing says heavy metal quite like ancient mythology involving dismemberment and ocean goddesses. Visual artists, both Inuit and non-Inuit, have created countless representations of Sedna. From traditional Inuit stone sculptures showing her with a seal tail and fingerless hands, to contemporary paintings exploring her emotional depth, to graphic novel adaptations of her story, Sedna has inspired visual art across multiple mediums and styles. There's even a dwarf planet named after her. In 2004, astronomers discovered a planetoid beyond Pluto and named it 90377 Sedna. It's a fitting tribute in a way, a cold, distant object in the outer reaches of our solar system, orbiting in a realm few can reach, much like the goddess herself dwelling at the bottom of the sea. But this popularization raises important questions about cultural appropriation and respect. When does sharing a story become stealing it? When does adaptation become distortion? Who has the right to tell Sedna's story, and who benefits from its telling? Some Inuit cultural leaders welcome the broader interest in Sedna, seeing it as an opportunity to share Inuit culture and perspectives with a wider audience. They appreciate when non-Inuit creators consult with Inuit advisors, share credit and compensation, and present the story in ways that honor its origins. Others are more skeptical or critical, particularly when Sedna is used in ways that strip away her cultural context, when she's turned into a generic ocean goddess, indistinguishable from figures from completely different mythologies, or when her story is used to sell products or promote messages that have nothing to do with Inuit values. The question of who can tell indigenous stories is complex and doesn't have a simple answer. But what's generally agreed upon is this: if you're going to engage with Sedna's story, do it with respect. Acknowledge where the story comes from. Don't claim it as your own creation. Listen to Inuit voices about their own culture, and recognize that this isn't just a cool myth for entertainment. It's a living story with ongoing significance for real people. When done well, sharing Sedna's story across cultures can be powerful. It can introduce people to Inuit perspectives, challenge assumptions about indigenous peoples being primitive or simple, and offer alternative ways of thinking about human relationships with the natural world. When done poorly, it's just another example of indigenous cultures being mined for content to sell products to non-indigenous consumers, a form of colonialism that takes cultural knowledge without giving anything back. The difference matters. Now let's dive into something fascinating. What does Sedna's story reveal about human psychology? Because beyond its cultural and environmental significance, this is also a story about trauma, transformation, and power. From a psychological perspective, Sedna's story is rich with meaning. Let's break it down. First, there's the father-daughter relationship and its betrayal. In Jungian psychology, the father represents authority, protection, and connection to the wider world. Sedna's father fails at all of these. He gives his daughter to a deceiver, then when attempting to rescue her, he ultimately murders her. This is the ultimate violation of trust, the breaking of the most fundamental human bond. Many people who have experienced betrayal by family members or authority figures find deep resonance in Sedna's story. It validates the enormity of that betrayal. It says, yes, this is as terrible as it feels. Yes, it changes everything. Yes, you have the right to be angry. But Sedna's story doesn't end with victimhood. And this is crucial. Sedna doesn't simply die. She transforms. Her dismemberment, rather than destroying her, becomes the source of her power. The pieces of her body become the animals that humans depend on. Her pain becomes purpose. Her suffering becomes sovereignty. This is a powerful psychological archetype. The wounded healer, the suffering figure who gains wisdom and power through their ordeal. We see this in many mythologies. Odin hanging on the world tree to gain knowledge, Inanna descending to the underworld and returning transformed, Jesus crucified and resurrected. But Sedna's transformation has a particular character. She doesn't forgive her betrayers. She doesn't heal in the sense of returning to how she was before. She becomes something entirely new, something powerful, something to be reckoned with. For survivors of trauma, This offers a different narrative than the typical forgiveness and healing story often pushed by mainstream psychology. Sedna says, "You don't have to forgive. You don't have to get over it. Your anger is valid. Your pain is real, and you can transform it into power." At the same time, Sedna's story also contains a warning about unprocessed trauma. Her anger, when not acknowledged and soothed, causes suffering not just to her betrayers, but to entire communities of people who had nothing to do with her original injury. Her tangles must be combed out, which means the pain must be acknowledged and addressed, or it spreads. This is psychologically profound. Unprocessed trauma doesn't stay contained. It affects everyone around the traumatized person. The tangles in Sedna's hair represent not just the transgressions committed against her, but all subsequent transgressions, all the ways that pain perpetuates pain. The shaman's journey to comb her hair represents therapy, reconciliation, and the hard work of healing. The shaman can't force Sedna to release the animals. They can't command or control her. They can only offer care, acknowledge the pain, and gently work through the tangles. This is remarkably similar to modern trauma therapy. You can't force healing. You can't demand that someone get over it. You can only create space for the pain to be acknowledged, provide gentle, consistent care, and slowly work through the difficult emotional tangles. There's also something here about the body keeping score, to borrow Bessel van der Kolk's phrase. Sedna's body was literally dismembered, and that dismemberment is permanent. She will never have fingers again. The trauma is inscribed in her physical form forever. Yet she continues. She has power. She has purpose. She is a goddess. For people living with the permanent effects of trauma, physical disability resulting from violence, or scars that will never fully fade, Sedna offers a powerful image. You can be both wounded and powerful. You can be both broken and whole. Your suffering doesn't make you weak. It made you into something that cannot be ignored. Now let's talk about Sedna through a feminist lens, because this story has a lot to say about gender, power, and patriarchy. On the surface, Sedna's story seems to be about a woman who is entirely passive and victimized. She's deceived by a husband, betrayed by her father, dismembered and drowned. Men make all the decisions. Men control her fate. She's passed from father to husband and ultimately destroyed by both. But look deeper, and something more complex emerges. Yes, Sedna is victimized, but the result of that victimization is that she becomes the most powerful being in Inuit mythology. She controls the food supply. She determines whether communities live or starve. The men who harmed her? One is dead or eternally enslaved in her realm. The other was never human to begin with. But Sedna? She's immortal, powerful, and ultimately unkillable. From a feminist perspective, this is interesting. The story doesn't erase or minimize male violence against women. It doesn't excuse the father's actions or the husband's deception. Instead, it shows these acts for what they are: terrible betrayals with cosmic consequences. And here's the key. The entire human community becomes dependent on Sedna's goodwill. The hunters, typically men, cannot succeed without her permission. The shamans must approach her with humility and respect. She has veto power over the entire economy and survival of the culture. Some feminist scholars read Sedna as a story about women's power emerging from and despite male violence. The patriarchal acts of the father don't successfully control or eliminate the daughter. Instead, they transform her into something beyond patriarchal control, a goddess who must be approached with respect and whose anger has real consequences. The tangles in her hair can be read as the accumulated weight of patriarchal violence and disrespect toward women. When men, primarily hunters, break taboos, when they treat animals or women disrespectfully, it literally causes Sedna pain. And until that pain is acknowledged and addressed, she withholds her gifts. This creates an interesting power dynamic. The masculine realm of hunting depends entirely on maintaining right relationship with the feminine realm of the sea goddess. Men's success is contingent on respecting boundaries and honoring agreements. When they fail to do so, they suffer the consequences. The shaman's journey to comb Sedna's hair can be read as the emotional labor required to maintain relationships after violation. Interestingly, while most Inuit shamans were men, some were women, and the act of combing hair is traditionally feminine-coded labor, gentle, caring, intimate. The shaman must perform this feminized labor of care to restore balance. Some feminist critics, however, argue that this reading is too generous. They point out that Sedna's power comes only after she's been mutilated. She gains power through suffering, which can reinforce problematic narratives that women's suffering is somehow ennobling or that women must be violated to become powerful. They also note that while Sedna is powerful, she's also isolated and monstrous in some tellings, living alone at the bottom of the ocean, neither fully alive nor dead, unable to participate in human community. Is this really empowerment, or is it just another way of removing powerful women from society? There's also the question of Sedna's anger and how it's portrayed. When Sedna withholds animals, she's often described as being vengeful or spiteful. But if a man in mythology becomes angry after being betrayed and murdered, he's often portrayed as justifiably seeking revenge. The gendered language around Sedna's anger is worth examining. Contemporary Inuit women have various perspectives on Sedna. Some embrace her as a symbol of female power and resilience. Others relate to her story of family betrayal and transformation. Still others focus on her role as a mother figure, noting that the animals are her children, born from her body, and her withholding of them is like a mother refusing to feed ungrateful children. What's clear is that Sedna's story contains enough complexity to support multiple feminist readings. She's neither a simple victim nor a simple empowerment narrative. She's a woman who suffered terrible violence, transformed into a powerful being, and whose relationship with humanity remains forever complicated by that originating trauma. Let's zoom out now and look at Sedna in the context of world mythology. Because while her specific story is unique to Inuit culture, many of her themes appear in myths from around the world. First, there are other dismemberment myths where a god or goddess is cut apart and their body parts become features of the world. In Hindu mythology, the demon Vritra is dismembered and becomes various rivers. In Japanese myth, the goddess Izanami dies and becomes the land of the dead. In Norse mythology, the giant Ymir is killed and his body parts become the earth, sky, and sea. But Sedna is distinctive because her dismemberment creates animals rather than geological features, and because she survives the dismemberment to become a living goddess rather than simply a transformed corpse. Her body parts don't just become things. They become living creatures that she continues to control. There are also numerous sea deities across world mythologies: Poseidon in Greek myth, Yamoja in Yoruba tradition, Tangaroa in Maori belief, Ran in Norse mythology. But most of these deities were born as gods or are primordial forces. Sedna's human origin makes her unusual. The closest parallels might be found in other indigenous mythologies, particularly those from coastal peoples who depended on the sea. Many Native American, Polynesian, and other indigenous cultures have stories of sea beings who control marine life and must be appeased or honored for successful fishing and hunting. What distinguishes Sedna is the specificity of her trauma narrative and how it connects to ongoing human behavior. Many sea gods are simply powerful beings to be feared or respected. Sedna is a being whose specific pain is caused by specific human actions and who requires specific interventions to soothe. The theme of the betrayed woman who becomes powerful appears across many mythologies. Medusa in Greek mythology was a victim who became a monster. In Japanese folklore, some spirits are women who died in betrayal or violence and returned as vengeful ghosts. In Celtic mythology, there are banshees and other female spirits connected to death and warning. But again, Sedna is unique in that her power isn't purely destructive or vengeful. She provides for humanity even as she punishes them. She's necessary for survival even as she's dangerous. She's not a monster to be defeated, but a force to be maintained in balance. The closest parallels to Sedna's overall narrative structure might be found in other indigenous traditions where natural phenomena are explained through origin stories involving transformation through suffering. The Cherokee story of Corn Woman, who creates corn from her body, has some similarities. Various African creation myths involve deities whose bodies become food sources. What these comparative examples show us is that Sedna, while unique in her specifics, represents universal human attempts to understand several interconnected concepts. Where do the resources we depend on come from? Why do those resources sometimes become scarce? How should we relate to the sources of our survival? What are the consequences of disrespect or transgression? How do we restore balance when things go wrong? Different cultures answer these questions in different ways, creating different gods and goddesses, different origin stories, different rituals and practices. But the questions themselves are universal because they emerge from the universal human experience of dependence on forces beyond our complete control. Sedna is the Inuit answer to these questions, shaped by the specific realities of Arctic life, the absolute dependence on marine mammals, the harsh environment that leaves no room for error, the need for community cooperation and shared ethical standards for survival. Understanding Sedna in a comparative context doesn't diminish her uniqueness. Instead, it shows how a specific culture took universal human concerns and created a mythology that perfectly fit their particular circumstances and needs. Let's talk about how Sedna was actually worshipped and honored in traditional Inuit practice, because the story isn't just a story. It was the foundation for an entire system of rituals, taboos, and spiritual practices. First, there were the hunting rituals. Before setting out to hunt seals or other marine mammals, hunters would often perform rituals acknowledging Sedna's sovereignty over the animals. These might include offerings, small gifts of food, fresh water, or other items thrown into the sea for Sedna, prayers or songs, asking Sedna's permission to hunt and promising to treat the animals with respect. Purification rituals, ensuring the hunter was spiritually clean and had not violated any taboos that might anger Sedna. When a seal or other marine mammal was killed, specific rituals honored both the animal and Sedna. The animal's spirit had to be treated with respect to ensure it would be reborn and allow itself to be hunted again. In some traditions, fresh water was placed in the mouth of a killed seal, understanding that the animal came from Sedna's salty realm and might be thirsty for fresh water. Every part of the animal would ideally be used. Wasting meat was not just practically foolish, but spiritually dangerous, as waste would tangle Sedna's hair and cause her anger. For women, there were specific taboos related to Sedna, particularly around menstruation. Menstruating women often had to observe restrictions on their activities and might not be allowed near hunting equipment or recent kills. The logic was that menstrual blood was powerful and could anger Sedna or interfere with the relationship between hunters and hunted animals. When these taboos were broken, or when hunting became scarce for any reason, the community would hold a seance where the shaman journeyed to Sedna's realm. These weren't casual events, but serious ceremonies involving the entire community. The seance would typically take place in a darkened dwelling. The shaman would be bound with sealskin thongs and would fall into a trance while community members drummed and sang. As the shaman's spirit descended to Sedna, observers would report seeing the binding ropes mysteriously loosen and fall away, physical proof that the shaman's spirit had left their body. During the journey, the shaman would sometimes narrate what they were experiencing. "I'm passing through the mist. I see the guardian dog. I'm fighting to get past." The community would encourage them with songs and calls of support. When the shaman reached Sedna and combed her hair, they would also engage in a confessional practice. The shaman would ask Sedna what transgressions had been committed, and upon returning, would call for public confession. Community members would admit their violations. "I wasted seal meat. I broke the menstruation taboo. I was disrespectful to my wife." This public confession served multiple purposes. It identified the sources of Sedna's anger. It created social pressure to follow the rules. It allowed for community acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and it provided a mechanism for social reintegration after transgression. After confessions were made and the shaman reported that Sedna's hair was combed clean, there would often be a celebration. The crisis had been addressed. Balance was restored. The animals would return. And crucially, the animals did often return. Whether because the ceremonies happened to coincide with natural animal movement patterns, because the confessional process helped reduce social tensions that might have affected hunting cooperation, or because of something genuinely spiritual, the system generally worked well enough to be maintained for thousands of years. Beyond these crisis interventions, there were also regular practices acknowledging Sedna, annual festivals or ceremonies honoring her, particularly in late winter when anticipating the return of migratory marine mammals. Songs and stories are told regularly, especially to children, teaching them about Sedna and the importance of respecting animals and following taboos. Art and crafts depicting Sedna served both spiritual and educational purposes. Naming practices, where some children might be given names related to Sedna or the sea, connecting them to her power. These practices weren't separate from daily life. They were integrated into every aspect of Inuit existence, from how you prepared for a hunt to how you treated your family members to how you disposed of waste. Sedna wasn't worshipped in a temple separate from ordinary life. She was acknowledged in the daily practices that made Arctic survival possible. So what do contemporary Inuit people think about Sedna? The answer is, it depends who you ask. The Inuit are not a monolithic group. There are distinct Inuit peoples across Arctic regions: Inupiat in Alaska, Inuit in Canada, Kalaalleq in Greenland, and others. Each has their own dialects, traditions, and relationships to stories like Sedna's. Moreover, individual Inuit people have diverse beliefs and perspectives, just like any other ethnic or cultural group. Some are traditional believers who maintain spiritual practices related to Sedna. Some are Christian and view Sedna as an important cultural story, but not a spiritual reality. Some are secular and see her as mythology. Some hold syncretic beliefs combining elements of Christianity and traditional spirituality. But despite this diversity, certain themes emerge when listening to contemporary Inuit voices about Sedna. First, there's nearly universal agreement that Sedna is culturally important regardless of whether she's spiritually believed in. She represents Inuit identity, heritage, and traditional knowledge. Knowing Sedna's story is part of being Inuit, connecting to ancestors and to the land. Second, many Inuit people emphasize that Sedna's story teaches important environmental lessons that remain relevant today. The idea that human behavior affects natural abundance, that resources must be respected and not wasted, that we're part of nature rather than separate from it. These teachings resonate strongly in an era of environmental crisis. Third, there's appreciation for how Sedna's story centers Inuit worldviews and values rather than Southern Canadian or American perspectives. In a world where Inuit voices are often marginalized or ignored, Sedna represents a specifically Inuit way of understanding the world. Fourth, there's sometimes frustration with how Sedna is portrayed by outsiders. Some Inuit people feel that non-Inuit artists, writers, and filmmakers don't really understand Sedna and use her image superficially or incorrectly. There's a desire for Inuit people to control their own narratives rather than having their stories interpreted and repackaged by others. Fifth, there's ongoing discussion about how to pass Sedna's story to the next generation. With many young Inuit people growing up in towns rather than on the land, with English often being their primary language rather than Inuktitut, and with smartphones and social media competing for their attention, how do you keep traditional stories alive and relevant? Some Inuit communities have responded by creating modern retellings of Sedna through various media. There are graphic novels created by Inuit artists, animated films, apps, and social media content presenting Sedna for contemporary audiences while maintaining cultural authenticity. Inuit educators often include Sedna in curriculum materials, teaching both the story itself and the broader cultural context it comes from. The goal is not just to preserve the past, but to show how traditional knowledge remains relevant for navigating present challenges. Some Inuit activists explicitly connect Sedna to contemporary political struggles. Just as Sedna demanded respect and punished those who took without proper acknowledgement, Inuit communities demand respect for their sovereignty, their land rights, and their traditional territories. The lesson of Sedna, that taking without permission and respect has consequences, applies to resource extraction companies, government policies, and climate change. There are also Inuit artists who work with Sedna's image in contemporary art, sometimes in ways that challenge traditional representations. These artists might depict Sedna as explicitly political, as suffering from modern pollution, as a symbol of indigenous resistance, or in other ways that extend the traditional story into new contexts. What's clear is that Sedna remains very much alive in Inuit culture, not as a frozen relic of the past, but as a living story that continues to evolve and speak to contemporary concerns while maintaining a connection to ancient wisdom. The question, do you believe in Sedna, might be less important than what does Sedna teach us? And on that question, even Inuit people with very different belief systems often find common ground. So what can those of us who aren't Inuit learn from Sedna's story? What lessons does this ancient Arctic mythology have for the modern world? Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that non-Inuit people should worship Sedna or appropriate Inuit spiritual practices. That's not the point. But stories can teach us things even when they come from cultures not our own, if we approach them with respect and humility. Here are some lessons I think Sedna offers to anyone willing to listen. Lesson 1. Actions have consequences. In our modern world, we often feel disconnected from the consequences of our choices. We flip a switch and lights come on without thinking about the power plant burning coal. We buy meat wrapped in plastic without thinking about the animal that died. We throw away waste without thinking about where it goes. Sedna's story reminds us that there is no way. Every action ripples outward. Every transgression tangles the hair. The consequences might not be immediate, but they accumulate. Eventually, the tangles must be addressed. Lesson 2. Survival depends on maintaining right relationship with the natural world. The Inuit understood that they couldn't survive by dominating nature. They had to negotiate with it, respect it, and understand themselves as part of it rather than rulers over it. Sedna enforced this understanding. Modern industrial civilization has tried to dominate nature rather than maintain a relationship with it. We're now seeing the consequences of that approach: climate change, species extinction, ecosystem collapse. Sedna's story suggests a different path, one based on respect, restraint, and recognition of our dependence on systems we don't control. Lesson 3. Trauma doesn't simply disappear. Sedna's pain persists across time. It must be acknowledged, addressed, and carefully tended. Ignoring it or demanding that it simply be gotten over only makes things worse. This applies at individual, community, and societal levels. Historical traumas, collective wounds, and unprocessed grief don't just fade away. They manifest in ongoing dysfunction until they're properly acknowledged and addressed. The shaman combing Sedna's hair is a powerful image for the hard, patient work of healing. Lesson 4. The vulnerable can become powerful. Sedna starts as a victim with no power. She ends as a goddess with ultimate power over human survival. Her transformation teaches that suffering doesn't have to be the end of the story. Victims can become agents. The wounded can become wise. The betrayed can become strong. This isn't to romanticize suffering or suggest that people need to suffer to gain power. But it does suggest that experiencing hardship doesn't permanently define someone as powerless. Transformation is possible, even from the darkest circumstances. Lesson 5. Power structures are not permanent. The father had power over Sedna. He used it to betray her. But his act of violence didn't secure his power, it destroyed it. Sedna became more powerful than he ever was, and he, in some versions, became her eternal servant. This is a lesson for anyone in a position of power over others. Misusing that power doesn't secure it. Betraying trust doesn't create safety. Violence doesn't establish lasting control. The power structures we think are permanent can be utterly transformed by their own transgressions. Lesson 6. Maintenance matters. Sedna's hair must be regularly combed. It's not a one-time fix. The relationship must be continuously maintained. This is true of any important relationship, with the environment, with each other, with our own psyches. We live in a culture that loves dramatic transformations and one-time solutions. But Sedna's story teaches that maintenance, the ongoing, unglamorous work of keeping things clean and functional, is actually what matters most. Lesson 7. Intermediaries have a crucial role. Shamans in Sedna's story aren't rulers or owners. They're intermediaries who can communicate between different realms. They don't control Sedna, they negotiate with her. Modern society often lacks good intermediaries between different groups, different perspectives, and different needs. We need more people and institutions that can facilitate communication and understanding rather than imposing control. These lessons aren't specifically about Sedna or Inuit culture. They're universal insights that Sedna's story happens to illustrate particularly well. That's the power of great mythology. It speaks to specific cultural circumstances while also touching something universal in human experience. Now, I want to address something that often gets glossed over when people discuss mythologies from non-Western cultures. Not every aspect of every traditional story aligns with modern values, and that's okay. Sedna's story contains elements that we might find troubling today. Let me be direct about them. The story can reinforce victim blaming. If bad hunting is caused by human transgressions that tangle Sedna's hair, then when people starve, it's because someone broke a taboo. This can lead to scapegoating, where communities blame individuals for collective suffering. Historical accounts describe instances where people, often women or vulnerable individuals, were accused of causing Sedna's anger and faced social punishment or even violence as a result. The gender dynamics are complicated. While Sedna is powerful, her power comes from mutilation. The taboos associated with her often restrict women's behavior more than men's, particularly around menstruation and childbirth. A feminist reader might ask, is this really empowerment, or is it another system of controlling women's bodies and behavior? The story can be interpreted to justify the harsh treatment of those perceived as different or burdensome. Some versions emphasize Sedna as being difficult or unreasonable before her transformation. This might reflect anxieties about caring for difficult family members and could potentially be used to rationalize abandonment or mistreatment of vulnerable people. The emphasis on confession and public acknowledgement of transgression could be used for social control, forcing conformity and punishing deviation from community norms in ways that might not always serve justice or individual well-being. None of this means Sedna's story is bad or shouldn't be told. Every mythology emerges from real human cultures with real human problems, and those cultures develop stories that help them navigate their specific challenges and circumstances. What seems troubling from a 21st century perspective might have served important functions in Arctic survival communities where cooperation and shared behavioral standards were literally matters of life and death. But it does mean we should approach the story with both appreciation and critical thinking. We can find wisdom in Sedna without endorsing every aspect of how her story was used historically. We can honor the Inuit culture that created and maintained this mythology while also acknowledging that, like all cultures, it had both light and shadow aspects. Contemporary Inuit people themselves have various relationships to these elements of the traditional stories. Some maintain traditional interpretations. Others reinterpret the stories in light of modern values. Still others acknowledge the problematic elements while still finding the stories culturally valuable. The key is to avoid both extremes. Don't idealize indigenous mythologies as perfect, flawless wisdom traditions that solve all modern problems. But also don't dismiss them as primitive superstitions that have no value. Approach them as complex cultural products created by real people navigating real challenges, containing both timeless wisdom and historically specific elements. Sedna's story has survived thousands of years and continues to resonate today not because it's perfect, but because it's profound. It grapples with real human experiences, betrayal, suffering, power, consequence, relationship, and offers ways of thinking about them that remain relevant even as the specific cultural context changes. Let's talk about how Sedna's story was traditionally told, because the medium shapes the message in important ways. Inuit oral tradition wasn't just about preserving information. It was a performance art, a teaching method, a form of entertainment, and a spiritual practice all rolled into one. Stories weren't recited from memory like memorizing a script. They were recreated each time, adapted to the audience, the situation, and the storyteller's gifts. A skilled Inuit storyteller would modulate their voice, use dramatic pauses, incorporate sound effects and gestures, and engage the audience in the experience. Children weren't passive listeners, but active participants, sometimes responding to questions or joining in repeated phrases. The setting mattered too. Stories were often told during the long Arctic winter nights when darkness stretched for months and the community gathered together for warmth and company. Imagine, you're in a dwelling lit only by seal oil lamps, the wind howling outside, temperatures far below zero, and someone begins to tell you about Sedna. In that context, Sedna isn't just a story. She's a presence, a reminder that beyond the thin walls of your shelter, powerful forces control your fate. The darkness outside is her realm. The seals you depend on are her children. The storm battering your home might be her anger. The oral tradition also meant that the story was flexible. Different storytellers emphasized different elements. Some focused on Sedna's betrayal and suffering. Others emphasized the hunting taboos and consequences. Still others highlighted the shaman's journey and the importance of spiritual intermediaries. Elders would adjust the story based on what lessons their audience needed to learn. If there had been wasteful behavior in the community, the version told might emphasize that particular transgression. If someone was about to undergo shamanic initiation, the version might focus more on the journey to Sedna's realm. This flexibility meant the story stayed alive and relevant. It wasn't frozen in a single authoritative version, but breathed and adapted with each telling. But oral tradition also has vulnerabilities. When the chain of transmission is broken, when elders die without passing on the stories, when children are taken to residential schools where traditional languages and stories are forbidden, knowledge can be lost quickly. This nearly happened to Sedna. For several generations during the height of colonization and cultural suppression, the story came close to being lost. Anthropologists recorded versions, which helped preserve them, but written records can't capture the full richness of oral performance. Fortunately, enough Inuit people maintained the traditions, either openly or in secret, that the story survived. Today, there are efforts to revitalize Inuit oral traditions, teaching young people not just the stories, but the art of storytelling itself. Modern technology offers new possibilities for preserving and sharing oral traditions. Audio and video recordings can capture performances in ways written text cannot. Digital archives can store multiple versions of stories, showing their flexibility and variation rather than imposing a single canonical version. But there's still something irreplaceable about hearing a story told in person by someone who learned it from their elders, who tells it in their own language, who adapts it to the moment and the audience. That's oral tradition at its best, and it's what has kept Sedna alive for thousands of years. While Sedna is the most famous sea deity in Inuit mythology, she's not the only supernatural being associated with the ocean in Arctic belief systems. Let's explore some of the other sea spirits and how they relate to Sedna. In many Inuit traditions, there are the Kalapalik, creatures that live in the water and are said to snatch children who wander too close to the shore. They're described as humanoid with green skin, long hair, and long fingernails, wearing an amati, a traditional parka with a baby pouch. They supposedly take children into the water in their amatis and keep them forever. On one level, Kalapalik stories are practical warnings. Don't let small children play unsupervised near dangerous water. But they're also spiritually connected to the sea's power and danger, similar to Sedna, but more predatory and less negotiable. Then there are the various spirits of individual seal species, whale species, and other marine animals. In traditional belief, each animal had its own spirit, its own personality and preferences. Successful hunting required understanding and respecting these spirits. The relationship between these animal spirits and Sedna varies in different tellings. In some, Sedna is the mother or mistress of all these spirits, controlling them absolutely. In others, she's more like a queen with subordinate, but semi-independent spirits serving her. In still others, the animal spirits have their own autonomy, but respect Sedna's authority over the sea realm. There are also spirits associated with specific locations, dangerous whirlpools, particular islands, and underwater caves. These place spirits might be independent of Sedna or might be part of her domain, depending on the tradition. Some stories feature Sedna's father as a continuing character in the underwater realm, either as her servant, her prisoner, or a guardian figure who protects her dwelling. His role varies dramatically between versions, but his presence connects the surface world to Sedna's realm. In some traditions, there are also spirits of drowned humans who didn't properly transition to the afterlife. These might be people who died breaking taboos, who were murdered, or who died in particularly tragic circumstances. They wander the ocean depths, sometimes serving Sedna, sometimes acting independently, sometimes causing trouble for the living. The shaman's journey to Sedna often involves encountering and navigating past these various spirits. They're obstacles, but also teachers, each one testing the shaman in different ways and offering different lessons. What's interesting is how this creates a complex spiritual ecology of the ocean. It's not just Sedna alone, but an entire realm of beings with different roles, relationships, and influences. This reflects the complexity of the ocean environment itself. Many species, many forces, many dangers and opportunities, all interacting. It also means that maintaining right relationship with the sea isn't just about appeasing one goddess. It's about navigating a complex network of spiritual relationships, each requiring its own form of respect and acknowledgement. Sedna has been represented in Inuit art for generations, and these representations tell their own story about how she's been understood and reimagined over time. Traditional Inuit art, particularly stone carving, often depicts Sedna with certain consistent features: a woman's torso, sometimes with a seal or fish tail instead of legs, and notably, hands without fingers or sometimes no hands at all. Her hair is often shown long and flowing. Sometimes seals, whales, or other marine animals are carved emerging from her hair or body, visualizing the connection between her dismemberment and the origin of these creatures. These carvings weren't just decorative. They served spiritual and educational purposes, helping to teach the story and maintain a connection to Sedna's power. They might be created for ceremonial use, as teaching tools, or as objects of meditation and reflection. The style of traditional Inuit carving is distinctive: smooth, flowing lines, economical detail, a sense of movement and life captured in stone. Sedna carvings embody these qualities, often conveying both her power and her suffering in simple but profound forms. In the 20th and 21st centuries, as Inuit art entered the commercial art market, representations of Sedna multiplied and diversified. Some artists maintained traditional styles and themes. Others experimented with new materials, techniques, and interpretations. Some contemporary Inuit artists depict Sedna in ways that explicitly address modern concerns. Sedna surrounded by plastic pollution, Sedna in melting ice, Sedna with oil spills in her hair. These pieces connect the ancient goddess to contemporary environmental crises, suggesting that her anger is more relevant than ever. Other artists explore Sedna's emotional and psychological dimensions: her fear as she clings to the kayak, her rage after betrayal, her loneliness at the ocean's bottom, her complex feelings toward the humans who depend on her. These representations humanize Sedna, inviting empathy rather than just respect or fear. Some artists play with scale and perspective, creating monumental Sedna figures that emphasize her power and importance, or intimate small carvings that invite close examination and contemplation. Inuit printmaking has also featured Sedna extensively. The graphic style of prints allows for different kinds of storytelling: sequential images showing her transformation, intricate patterns evoking the underwater realm, bold symbolic representations of her power. Non-Inuit artists have also represented Sedna, with varying degrees of success and cultural sensitivity. Some collaborate closely with Inuit advisors and create respectful, informed works. Others appropriate the image without understanding the cultural context, creating generic ocean goddess figures that have little connection to the actual Inuit stories. The best non-Inuit art featuring Sedna tends to be that which explicitly acknowledges its position as an outsider interpretation, that credits Inuit sources and traditions, and that seeks to honor rather than exploit the mythology. What all these artistic representations demonstrate is that Sedna continues to inspire creative response. She's a figure rich enough to support endless interpretation and reimagining, while still maintaining her essential character and power. Looking at the artistic record of Sedna representations over time is like watching the evolution of Inuit culture itself, adapting to new circumstances, maintaining core values, finding ways to speak to each generation's concerns while honoring ancestral wisdom. How do we teach Sedna's story in the 21st century? This question matters whether you're an Inuit parent passing culture to your children, an educator including indigenous perspectives in curriculum, or just someone who wants to share this powerful mythology respectfully? First, context is crucial. Sedna's story doesn't make complete sense without understanding something about Inuit culture, the Arctic environment, and the oral tradition from which it comes. Jumping straight to "here's a story about a goddess" misses so much. Good teaching of Sedna's story should include geographic and environmental context. Where did this story come from? What's the Arctic like? Why would a sea goddess be so important to people living there? Cultural context. Who are the Inuit people? What was their traditional way of life? How does this story fit into their broader belief system? Historical context. How has this story been affected by colonization? How has it survived and adapted? What relationship do contemporary Inuit people have with it? Multiple versions. Rather than presenting one correct version, acknowledging that there are many variations helps convey the nature of oral tradition and respects the diversity of Inuit cultures. For Inuit educators teaching their own children and communities, there are additional considerations about maintaining cultural authenticity, teaching in Inuktitut or other indigenous languages when possible, and connecting the story to ongoing cultural practices and values. Many Inuit educators emphasize experiential learning alongside storytelling, taking children onto the land, teaching traditional skills, helping them understand their environment in ways that make Sedna's story more immediate and relevant. For non-Inuit educators, there's the challenge of teaching the story respectfully without appropriating it. This means being clear that this is an Inuit story, not a universal myth that belongs to everyone. Using Inuit sources and perspectives as much as possible rather than filtered through non-Indigenous interpreters. Connecting the story to broader discussions of Indigenous rights, colonization, and environmental issues in ways that don't just use Indigenous stories as tools for non-Indigenous education. Being thoughtful about which elements of the story to emphasize and how to discuss its more troubling aspects in age-appropriate ways. Some educators use Sedna's story as a springboard for broader learning, studying Arctic geography, researching climate change impacts on Inuit communities, exploring oral traditions from various cultures, or examining how mythologies reflect environmental relationships. The key is ensuring that teaching Sedna's story doesn't reduce it to a quaint tale or a simple environmental fable. It's a complex, sophisticated mythology from a living culture that has survived against enormous odds and continues to evolve today. Digital resources have made it easier to access Inuit perspectives on Sedna directly. There are websites, videos, and online resources created by Inuit people themselves, sharing their stories in their own voices. These should be prioritized over secondary sources when possible. At the same time, there's something lost when stories migrate entirely to screens. The intimacy of in-person storytelling, the ability to adapt to the audience, the sense of shared experience, these elements of traditional oral culture don't fully translate to digital formats. The challenge going forward is finding ways to honor traditional storytelling methods while also leveraging modern technology to preserve and share stories with wider audiences, including younger generations who are growing up as digital natives. The academic study of Sedna has its own interesting history, revealing as much about scholars and their assumptions as about the mythology itself. Early anthropologists who documented Sedna's story in the late 19th and early 20th centuries approached it through the lens of their time's scholarly assumptions. Many were influenced by evolutionary theories of religion that positioned indigenous beliefs as primitive stages that would eventually evolve toward civilized Christianity. These early ethnographers nevertheless performed valuable work in documenting variations of Sedna's story from different communities, recording details that might otherwise have been lost. Scholars like Franz Boas, Knud Rasmussen, and others spent extended time with Inuit communities and created detailed records of their mythology and culture. However, their documentation was also limited by their own cultural biases and by the colonial context in which they worked. Some Inuit people were reluctant to share sacred stories with outsiders. Others told modified versions. The power dynamics of the situation: white scholars with institutional backing studying colonized indigenous people, affected what got recorded and how. Mid-20th century scholars began applying different analytical frameworks to Sedna's story. Structuralists looked for underlying patterns and oppositions. Psychoanalytic scholars interpreted the story through Freudian lenses. Functionalists examined how the story served social needs within Inuit communities. Each approach revealed certain aspects of the story while potentially obscuring others. The story became a text to be analyzed rather than a living tradition with ongoing significance. Feminist scholars brought new attention to Sedna in the late 20th century, reading her as a figure of female power and examining the gender dynamics in her mythology. This scholarship often made important points, but sometimes risked imposing modern Western feminist frameworks onto a very different cultural context. Environmental scholars and those working in environmental humanities have more recently turned to Sedna as an example of indigenous ecological knowledge. They examine how the story encodes a sophisticated understanding of human-environment relationships and argue for the relevance of indigenous perspectives to contemporary environmental crises. A crucial development in recent decades has been the growth of indigenous scholarship, where Inuit and other indigenous scholars study their own cultures from insider perspectives. This scholarship doesn't replace outsider studies, but it provides essential correctives and alternative interpretations. Indigenous scholars often emphasize aspects that non-indigenous researchers missed or misunderstood. They can explain cultural nuances, place stories in proper context, and challenge interpretations that, while perhaps well-meaning, fundamentally misunderstand the material. The tension between academic study and cultural respect remains ongoing. Some Inuit people appreciate scholarly attention to their traditions as validation and broader education. Others feel that too much academic scrutiny strips stories of their spiritual power and reduces living traditions to dead texts. There are also questions about who benefits from the academic study of indigenous cultures. When non-indigenous scholars build careers studying indigenous peoples, when universities profit from indigenous knowledge, when books and papers about Sedna are published without meaningful engagement with Inuit communities, who's really being served? Some scholars have responded by advocating for collaborative approaches, working directly with Inuit communities, involving them in research design, sharing findings in accessible ways, and ensuring that communities benefit from the research done about them. The best contemporary scholarship on Sedna tends to be interdisciplinary, combining insights from anthropology, environmental studies, religious studies, psychology, and other fields while remaining grounded in respectful engagement with Inuit perspectives and contemporary concerns. What we study reveals what we value. The fact that scholars continue to find Sedna worthy of study suggests her ongoing significance. But how we study her matters as much as the fact that we do. So where does Sedna go from here? What's the future of this ancient goddess in a rapidly changing world? The Arctic is transforming faster than perhaps any region on Earth. Ice that's been stable for millennia is melting. Animal patterns are shifting. Traditional Inuit ways of life are under enormous pressure. In this context, what happens to Sedna? One possibility is that Sedna becomes primarily a cultural symbol, maintained more as heritage than as a living spiritual practice. In this future, Inuit children learn about Sedna in cultural education programs. She appears in art and literature, but she's no longer actively believed in or practiced in the way she once was. Another possibility is religious revival. As indigenous peoples globally reclaim traditional spiritual practices suppressed by colonization, some Inuit communities might revitalize Sedna worship and shamanic traditions. This wouldn't necessarily be a return to exactly how things were done historically, but a conscious reconnection with ancestral spirituality adapted for modern contexts. A third possibility is evolution and synthesis. Sedna might be maintained alongside Christian or other beliefs in a syncretic practice that honors both traditional and introduced spiritual systems. This has precedent in many cultures where indigenous and introduced religions coexist and blend. Climate change adds urgency to Sedna's story. As the Arctic environment transforms, as traditional hunting becomes more difficult and unpredictable, as Inuit communities navigate the reality of losing their homelands to rising seas and melting ice, Sedna's story of broken relationships between humans and nature becomes devastatingly relevant. Some Inuit activists are already invoking Sedna in climate justice campaigns, arguing that the goddess's anger manifests in the changing climate and that restoration requires radical changes in how humanity relates to the natural world. Sedna becomes not just a traditional story, but a prophetic warning. There's also the question of how Sedna relates to younger generations growing up with smartphones, social media, and global connectivity, while also dealing with the specific challenges of being indigenous in contemporary nation-states that have historically marginalized their peoples. Can Sedna remain meaningful to young people whose daily lives look very different from those of their ancestors? Some say yes, if the story is presented in ways that speak to contemporary concerns and experiences. Others worry that the cultural distance is too great, that without lived connection to traditional hunting and Arctic survival, the story loses its power. Digital media offer new possibilities for sharing Sedna's story. Animated versions, video games, augmented reality experiences, and other technologies can present the mythology in formats familiar and engaging to digital natives. But they also risk flattening the story, reducing it to entertainment divorced from cultural context. The internationalization of Sedna's story also raises questions. As more non-Inuit people learn about her, as she appears in popular culture and academic discourse globally, does she become a universal figure, or does this represent another form of cultural extraction? Inuit communities are actively grappling with these questions, making choices about how to maintain their cultural traditions while adapting to contemporary realities. There's no single answer, and different communities are taking different approaches. What seems certain is that Sedna, who has already survived thousands of years and multiple existential threats to Inuit culture, is unlikely to disappear. She may transform, as she has transformed before. She may look different to future generations than she does to current ones. But the core of her story, about betrayal and power, about human relationships with nature, about the consequences of broken agreements, remains profoundly relevant. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Sedna's future is how her story illuminates the stakes of the present moment. If humanity continues on its current path of environmental destruction, if indigenous peoples continue to have their lands taken and their cultures suppressed, if we fail to learn the lessons that stories like Sedna's teach, then the consequences will be dire. But if we can learn to maintain the right relationship, to respect the living world, to acknowledge and untangle the accumulated damage of our transgressions, then perhaps, like the hunters after the shaman's successful journey, we might find abundance returning. Sedna's future is intimately connected to humanity's future. She reminds us that we're all in this together, tangled in the same web of consequence and connection. The question is whether we'll comb out the tangles before it's too late. We've journeyed deep into the story of Sedna, goddess of the sea. From her origins as a human daughter to her violent transformation into a deity, From her dwelling at the bottom of the ocean to her continuing presence in Inuit culture today, we've explored the many facets of this powerful mythology. We've seen how Sedna's story emerged from the specific realities of Arctic life, reflecting the absolute dependence on marine mammals and the harsh environment where survival meant maintaining balance and respecting boundaries. We've understood how oral tradition kept the story alive across thousands of years, adapting it to different communities while maintaining its essential core. We've examined how Sedna represents sophisticated ecological knowledge, how her story encodes an understanding of human-environment relationships that modern science is only now fully appreciating. The tangles in her hair, the withholding of animals, the necessity of acknowledging transgression and restoring balance. All of this reflects deep wisdom about consequence and connection. We've explored the psychological dimensions of Sedna's story, how it speaks to trauma and transformation, to the power that can emerge from suffering, to the reality that pain doesn't simply disappear, but must be continuously tended and honored. We've considered feminist readings of Sedna, recognizing both her power as a female deity who controls human survival and the troubling aspects of her story regarding gender and violence. We've acknowledged that mythology is complex, containing both light and shadow, and that we can find wisdom in stories while also thinking critically about them. We've seen how Sedna survived colonization and cultural suppression, how she remains alive in contemporary Inuit culture, and how she's being reimagined for modern contexts, including climate change activism and environmental justice. We've looked at how Sedna appears in art, literature, popular culture, and academic study, how she's been represented and sometimes misrepresented, and how questions of cultural respect and appropriation continue to matter. And we've considered Sedna's future, how this ancient goddess continues to evolve and speak to new generations facing challenges her original tellers could never have imagined. But beyond all the analysis and interpretation, at its heart, Sedna's story is this. A girl was betrayed by those who should have protected her. She suffered unimaginable violence. She was dismembered and drowned. But she didn't simply die. She transformed. Her pain became power. Her severed fingers became the animals that feed entire peoples. She became a goddess, neither fully living nor fully dead, dwelling in a realm beyond human reach, controlling forces humans depend upon but cannot dominate. And she remembers. She carries the memory of betrayal, and when humans act with disrespect or cruelty, her hair becomes tangled, and she withholds her gifts. But she's not merely vengeful. When someone approaches her with humility and care, when the tangles are acknowledged and gently combed free, she releases the animals and allows life to continue. This is a story about a relationship, about how our actions affect the world around us, about how trauma persists and must be honored, about how power dynamics can be transformed, about how survival depends on maintaining balance and showing respect. It's a story that the Inuit people created and maintained because it helped them survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It encoded crucial knowledge, enforced essential behaviors, and provided frameworks for understanding why things happened and how to respond when things went wrong. And it's a story that remains relevant today, perhaps more relevant than ever, as we face the consequences of centuries of disrespecting the natural world, of breaking our relationships with the systems that sustain us, of allowing the tangles to accumulate without addressing them. Sedna asks us, what is your relationship with the living world? How do you honor the beings and systems that feed and sustain you? When you have caused harm, do you acknowledge it and make amends? Or do you let the tangles continue to accumulate? Are you willing to do the hard, patient work of combing out the knots? These aren't abstract questions. They have concrete implications for how we live, what we consume, how we use resources, how we treat the environment, and how we organize our societies. Sedna doesn't offer easy answers or comfortable reassurances. She's a goddess born from violence, marked by betrayal, carrying eternal memory of suffering. She's not here to make us feel good about ourselves or to validate our current path. She's here to remind us that actions have consequences, that relationships must be maintained, and that ignoring accumulated damage doesn't make it disappear. But she also offers hope, because if someone is willing to make the dangerous journey to her realm, if someone approaches her with genuine humility and care, if the tangles are acknowledged and patiently worked through, she does release the animals. She does allow abundance to return. Balance can be restored. Not permanently, not once and for all, but for now, for this season, for this time, balance can be restored. And then we must do the work again, because that's what a relationship means. It's not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing commitment. Sedna has been teaching this lesson for thousands of years. The question is whether we're finally ready to listen. If this story resonated with you, if Sedna's journey from daughter to goddess, from victim to force of nature, touched something in you, then I invite you to do a few things. First, if you want to learn more, seek out Inuit voices and perspectives. Read books by Inuit authors. Watch films by Inuit filmmakers. Support Inuit artists and cultural organizations. Don't let me, a non-Inuit person, be your only source for this story. Go to the source. Second, think about how Sedna's lessons apply to your own life. What tangles have accumulated in your relationships? With the natural world? With other people? With yourself? What patient, humble work of combing through those tangles might be needed? Third, if you care about environmental issues, about climate change, about indigenous rights, then act on that care. Support organizations working on these issues. Listen to indigenous voices leading environmental movements. Make choices in your own life that reduce harm and honor the living world. And finally, share this story, but share it responsibly. Tell people where it comes from. Acknowledge its cultural origins. Don't strip it down to a generic ocean goddess tale. Honor its complexity and its specific Inuit context. Stories like Sedna survive because people tell them, because they find them meaningful enough to pass on. By engaging with this story, by thinking about it, by letting it challenge and change you, you participate in keeping it alive. If you found value in this deep dive into Sedna's mythology, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future explorations of myths and stories from around the world. Drop a comment sharing what aspects of Sedna's story most resonated with you, or what other mythologies you'd like me to explore. And if you really want to support this channel and help me continue creating long-form, in-depth content about mythology and folklore, consider becoming a patron or channel member. Your support makes this work possible. Thank you for taking this journey with me to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, to the dwelling of the goddess of the sea. May Sedna's story stay with you, tangling in your thoughts like debris in her hair, demanding acknowledgement, calling for change. Remember, the sea goddess is watching. The tangles are accumulating, and someone, eventually, will need to make the journey to set them free. Will it be you? For more deep dives into mythology and folklore from around the world, check out these videos. And don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, honor your stories, respect your sources, and may your relationships with the living world be balanced and true. Thank you for watching.